Everybody awake? Happy to be here?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm enjoying this 1 degree difference in the atmosphere here that's different than when it was when we came in. It felt like it was 33 degrees when we came in, and now it is a nice, crisp 74. And I love it. The church heater works. It's great. So, somebody tell me what book we're in.
Leviticus.
Numbers.
I knew that.
Numbers. Leviticus continued. Numbers.
It's just the next one over.
It's just the next one. Just
Next
one book
county.
different.
I
Well-
thought we were still in Genesis.
Well, so technically it could be, Genesis part 4.
Yeah, anything before,
Genesis,
you
Leviticus.
know, Matthew is Genesis. So.
Technically, it's yeah. So we're actually in the book of Numbers, and Numbers is not really the Hebrew name for this book. You may remember what the Hebrew name is or what it means. What is it?
Through the wilderness.
In the wilderness or during the wilderness. It's more of an expression than it is just a name. It's about the time while they're in the wilderness. So it covers a good span of time. It's right after God gives the instructions for the tabernacle or the temple, and then going into the promised land. So it starts right after the tabernacle plan, ends right before the promised land. So last week we covered the murmurings of the people, and I love that word murmuring. I think I'm going to use it more often. Stop murmuring. Murmuring. It sounds like a hair-lip dog. I don't know. I like it. But anyway, what were they murmuring about? Anybody remember?
Because they don't have any meat.
They want to meat, and they remember the meat in Egypt.
No garlic.
No garlic. No leeks.
No leeks, no garlic.
Leeks. Have y'all ever seen a leek? Do y'all know what a leek is?
Yep.
Okay.
You don't need a plumber.
I was blown away. Spirit of stand-up comedies over here on the second pew. I was blown away the first time. I think we were actually in Arkansas, and we got a box of produce from either Angels something or another, whatever it was called. Some kind of it was kind of like food bank, but it wasn't food bank. Anyway, and there was the biggest onion I had ever seen in my life in this box. And not an onion like a round one, but one of the long ones with the green stem thingy, kind of like you pull up out of your ground, like a wild onion. But the thing was like this big around, and it was like this tall. And I remember actually calling my mom. I was like, this is the biggest onion I have ever seen in my life. It's like huge, it's like chunky. And she's like, Amy, that's a leek. I was like, yeah, and it's the biggest onion I've ever seen in my life. I don't even know what you do with a leek, but whatever.
They're good if they're cooked right.
Do they taste like an onion?
No. They
No?
taste more like celery.
Sure does look like an onion. It's just
They
big.
taste like
I
celery.
don't know, probably good with garlic.
It's good with garlic
Just put
and
some garlic
fish.
on it, it'd be
And
good.
meat.
Apparently, and fish. Yeah, that's what they wanted from Egypt was yeah, well, meat,
Fish.
fish. Yeah. Okay, so they did murmur a lot, but their main problem was that they didn't have any meat, and they wanted the meat. Deep down, it was selfishness, and it was self-focused issues.
Yeah.
The murmuring of the people we considered, we actually went through the whole story and how the place was called the Grave of Cravings. That is powerful to me. This week we're actually covering a small chapter. It's not one of those chapters that goes on forever, and it kind of covers the same idea. This chapter takes place right after the people who died on the outskirts because they went bird hunting and caught the quail and all that. It goes right past that, and it's before the spies are sent into the promised land. Okay, so it's like this little side chapter thing. But nothing in the Bible happens by chance. Everything is in there for a reason. There's a purpose. You need to know this for a reason. Even the small chapters that seem to sidetrack, they often reveal a person's character. And that brings a better understanding to the context. An example of that in some of our study would be Judah and his little escapades, and then his relationship with his daughter-in-law, and how that repentant heart gave us kind of a type and shadow, and it was a powerful thing. It was just one random chapter that has this story that you wouldn't think would relate to anything. but we see how it did tie into the narrative. So the background of chapter 12, Numbers chapter 12, is where we're at. The Lord had just shown the people that they cannot lean on their own cravings. They must trust Him. There were consequences to rebellion. The people on the outskirts of the gathering died. Why? Was it because they wanted birds?
Because they turned their back to the
Because they left the presence of God
Yes.
to follow after their own lust. And remember, lust can be anything that you crave or that you want bad enough to take action, bad enough to prioritize it over the presence of God. That's a lust. The people wanted the meat so badly that they were willing to go outside of the camp, outside of the protection, outside of the presence of God. That's a key point right there. They stepped out of their protection
Right.
in
That's
order
right.
to go after their craving.
Yeah.
If you get anything out of that story, that's what that should be. Chapter 12 is actually very similar to that, but it has a different form of rebellion. See, rebellion takes many forms.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of times when I think of rebellion, I think of, they used to call them terrible twos. I don't know what they call them now. It's like, I don't know, terrible 30s or something. But anyway, you see this little kid stomp up there. Whoa, no. Jesus bless them and their parents. That's what I think of when I think of rebellion. I think of a teenager. You can tell me what to do. As they walk off and make a dumb decision that ruins their life. And the whole time you're thinking,
Yeah.
and then they come back and they're like, I wish I had listened to you. Yeah.
Yeah, we do too.
Makes two of us. Yep. But rebellion doesn't always look like that. Sometimes it is not as obvious. So first of all, this is going to be a little bit different, but let's look at the characters that are in this narrative, okay? So everybody's awake. I'm going to ask some questions. I need some dialogue here. We need some interaction. We're going to look at the main characters, kind of like it's a play. First of all, we know we have Moses, okay? How old is Moses by this time? Anybody want to guess? 300? No. We know he died at, 120? Wandered for 40 years. He was in Egypt for 40 years, in Midian for 40 years, so, yeah, roughly 100, we'll say. Maybe 90s. Yeah, somewhere around in there. Okay, so he old. He's old. God had called Moses to be the leader of the people. Okay, we've covered quite a bit about him. Even when he was trying to run, God still provided for him. Even when he had legitimate excuses. God, I'm good with speech. I don't talk plainly. I've messed up. Oh, yeah, you're right. You've got all those failures. Here's Aaron. He'll speak for you. Check. Next. God had provided for him in every way that he needed. He even protected him from the anger of the people. More than once, the people were ready to get rid of Moses. Think about that. So he's one of the key players in this narrative. Another one is Aaron. Somebody tell me something about Aaron. Who is Aaron?
Moses' brother.
Moses' older brother. Okay, he's already been there to assist Moses. Like we just talked about it, God had positioned him there. Tell me something else about Aaron.
He had
Priest.
children straight.
He's a priest.
He helped build that statue that they all worship. And he was like, let's do it, friends.
Right. He slipped back into the idolatrous ways of the Egyptians and created the statue, but obviously he had to have a repentant heart at some point because he was able to move past that. He had 4 sons, but at this point 2 of them have already died because of ignorance or arrogance, whatever the situation. But he is still the high priest. He is still in a place of leadership, even though his family, some of them, they messed up, and he's messed up. But God called him and placed him and anointed him, which means he had to have kept a repentant heart. That didn't disqualify him. And part of that may have been more for the benefit of the people than for Aaron. Sometimes mercy is. Another key character in this is Miriam. Miriam is Aaron and Moses' sister. Y'all want to give me some details on her? Can you remember anything that Miriam had to do with in any of the stories?
She grabbed a tambourine when they came across it.
Okay,
Jordan,
all right.
pay attention to that.
So I don't know that I even covered that story, did I? I don't remember. Well, at the very beginning, she's there when Moses is born, and then she is instrumental in saving his life.
Mm-hmm.
You know, she sneaks the basket to the Nile River. She follows it down. She tells the daughter or wife or whatever of Pharaoh, and I say that because there's, anyway, that, hey, I've got a nursemaid that can come and take care of this baby. You know, let me help. So she's already been used. Even at a young age, she's being used by God to help things fall into place and position to where God's going to do what he's going to do.
That's right.
So she's already been used there. She is instrumental in uniting the people. When they cross the Red Sea, she's the first one to grab the tambourine and lead a victory parade and start praise and worship. She is powerful. The Bible actually calls her a prophetess. So she's part of this family ministry. She leads the Israelite women in dancing and music, and she sings praises and victory songs. You can see that in Exodus 15, verse 20 and 21. At the time of this narrative that we're going to talk about tonight, she is at least 90 years old. Okay, so she's elderly at this time. According to historians, she married Hur, who was one of the judges who held Moses' arms up during that first battle. It was not Ben-Hur, but it was just Hur. And that would have been the son of Caleb. We'll hear later in the next chapter, we'll hear about Joshua and Caleb. Caleb's son Hur was married to Miriam. That would have made her the grandmother of Bezalel, who was the artist who built the tabernacle stuff. Remember when God spoke to Moses and he said, I want you to build all this stuff, but you're not actually going to do it. I've already placed the talent and the desire and all of the information in this young man. That would have been Miriam's grandson. She was a key figure in uniting the nation. But the important thing to look at the character of Miriam is that she was patriotic. We see a lot of motives in a lot of people in the Bible, but Miriam was concerned with her nation. You can tell she acts on the behalf of her people. She's political. She wants not necessarily what's best for me, but what's best for my people. That's leadership skills. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
In its place. It's a good thing. All right, so we have Miriam and we have Aaron and we have Moses. And what about Zipporah? Zipporah is another person in this particular narrative, even though she's not actually mentioned. Anybody know who Zipporah is?
Moses' wife.
Moses' wife. Okay. She is a daughter of Jethro or Ril, whatever his name is. We talked about that last week from Midian. Remember, he was a Midianite priest. I promise I'm getting somewhere. Y'all bear with me. I promise. It's going to make sense in a second. Okay, so follow me just for a second on who Zipporah was. Remember when Moses fled from Pharaoh and he goes across the Red Sea. We don't talk about that a whole lot, but he had to cross the Red Sea, goes over into this little peninsula area, and he goes into the land of Midian. And there he meets Jethro, who was a priest. We know that these are extended family members. They're descendants, just like Moses would have been. Okay? So he goes there, he meets Jethro, he marries Zipporah. They have 2 sons, and then he goes back to Egypt to deliver the people 40 years later. All right? Or 40 years, and then he has the sons, and then he goes back, whatever. However that timeline worked. Let's talk about Zipporah just for a second. Let's look at her lineage. She was a Midianite, which means she was a descendant of Abraham. She was a descendant of Abraham and Keturah. Keturah was a servant. You can see that in Genesis 25 and 2, Nicolay. In Genesis 25 and 2. She was a Midianite. Now, you're going to have to watch this or you're going to think I'm making it up, okay? Or you're going to get in your car tonight and think, where'd she get that from? Well, I'm showing you, so hang with me. All right. And he's talking about Keturah here, talking about how she bore sons until Abraham, and she bore him Zimram and Jokshan and Midian and Midian. Midian became the founder of the Midianites. All right, everybody with me on that?
Mm-hmm.
All right. They were from the lineage of Shem. Are you with me? Okay. Do you remember when we talked about Noah coming off the ark and his 3 sons became the fathers of nations, and they split and went different ways? And some of them one of them became like the father of the Asia, whatever, and then one of them went into the Africa area and became the father of the black people. Do you remember I was talking about that? That son was Ham. Ham is the father of the Cushites. The Cushites are the dark people. The Cushites are the Ethiopian people. All right, everybody with me on that?
Yeah.
Okay. Zipporah was not from the descendants of Ham. That's important to know. Now let's look at this next person in this narrative. We have the Ethiopian wife,
Right.
who is not Zipporah. Could not be Zipporah, because she is not from the descendants of the Cushites. So that's why I asked this. All right, so let's look at chapter 12, verse 1. And Miriam and Aaron, the brothers of Moses, spake against Moses because of the Ethiopian woman whom he had married. For he had married an Ethiopian woman. A little redundant there in that wording, right? So let me give you just a short history. That's going to make some of this make sense. Not all of this is in the Bible. We find this from the victory steels, which are like the carvings, the engravings, whatever, that show who conquered who and all that kind of stuff. So during the 40 years that Moses was being raised in Egypt, there was a very powerful kingdom in Ethiopia. And I actually had this on my PowerPoint and I forgot it. But anyway, if you look at the map, you have Egypt right here. You have the Red Sea that goes down and there's like a V of water. Remember that? Mm-hmm. Right here you have Egypt. Directly underneath it you have Ethiopia. Okay? And it's a huge land. And their borders go side by side. Whenever you had 2 lands that were very big and powerful and full of resources, it was very common for them to be at each other's throats. They were fighting for power and control of the resources. They were fighting over the port cities, what can get in and what can go out and all that kind of stuff. So there was a very powerful kingdom called Meroe in Ethiopia during this time. The people were enemies of Egypt. That caused a lot of issues. According to the historian Josephus, which we use a lot of his stuff, Moses was nourished in Pharaoh's palace and was appointed general of the army against the Ethiopians. Remember, he spent 40 years in Egypt before he straightened up and then he killed somebody and then he ran.
Mm-hmm.
A lot can happen in 40 years.
Yeah.
Okay, he's raised in the palace. He actually conquered the Ethiopians during that time and married the daughter of the king. Now, this was not to make him the prince of Ethiopia. It was actually kind of like a hostage situation. Because if this person conquers this person and they marry the daughter of this king, it keeps this king in order. Because if he starting this anarchy, or if he starts a rebellion, then they're holding the daughter prisoner.
Yeah.
So it's not a Hallmark Channel love and romance story. Okay, it's I have control of you because I have something that's precious to you. I have a princess that belongs to you in my castle. Does that make sense? Okay, so according to Josephus, Moses actually married this Ethiopian princess because she was part of the spoils of the war. Also, according to this historical account, her name was, ready? Tharbis. 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 Arbis. According to the story, she actually fell in love with Moses and delivered the city to him. She was manipulative enough that she let him or caused him to actually win the battle so that she could go with him. You also see in the historian Herodotus, Pharaoh was the first Egyptian king to ever rule Ethiopia. And that was all because of Moses' victory. So this is not actually in the Bible, but we have 3 or 4 historical accounts that put Moses in the army of Pharaoh during the time when he and Ethiopia were at war. So this would have put an Ethiopian princess in the place where she would have married someone in Pharaoh's house. Does that make sense? Everybody with me there?
Yeah.
We know that when Moses left, and when he ran for his life, he went alone. So that means he left his Ethiopian wife in Egypt. And he ran out into the desert, probably thinking, I will never see anybody there ever again. Marrying her was a political thing. I don't know. I'm sure he justified that somehow. And he went to start his own life all over again and find whatever. But when he goes back and delivers the people, remember I said last week that when God delivered the children of Israel from Egypt, there was a mixed group of people that left.
Yeah.
Mixed group, meaning there were Ethiopians that left as well. Meaning that she most likely left as well, because if she had stayed in the camp, she stayed in Egypt, she would have been killed. Because she's already shown affection for Moses. So that's where we have the Ethiopian lady coming in. This marriage was probably just an excuse. Have you ever noticed that when somebody wants to be mad, they'll find a reason?
Yes. Yep.
I think I was talking to Nick yesterday about something. I don't remember what it was. And I was like, that really makes me mad. And it really makes me mad because I really don't have a reason to be mad, but I just feel like I should be right now. So, give me 5 minutes and I'll be over it, but just I feel like I need to be mad about this and then I'll be fine. But I'm really aggravated because I don't have something to be mad about. And that's a lot of wording, but it really does put into realistic view how a lot of us are in a lot of ways. Because we feel like we need to respond to something emotionally. When truthfully, if we would just lay off a couple of the cups of coffee and get some sugar out of our system, we probably wouldn't be as agitated as easy. But bless the Lord anyway. So when Moses and Aaron grumbles about this Ethiopian wife, I really don't feel like it had anything to do with the Ethiopian wife. I think it revealed an issue. For instance, you got some stuff that that's picking at you, and you're just aggravated about everything. Just rah, 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 rah. And then pastor comes in and he's focused on, catching the child that's rolling down the stairs or whatever, and he has the nerve to walk right past you on the way to saving this child. He does not shake your hand. He does not look you in the eyeball, and that is uncalled for, and you're done with it. Doesn't matter that the child is about to land on his face down the stairs. The fact that pastor did not shake your hand, he did not make eye contact with you, that is uncalled for, and revival can't happen as long as you have a pastor like that. Right?
Yep.
Okay, moving on. That happens at other churches. The real issue here was jealousy. And we'll get into that in just a second. If the root of the problem is jealousy, though, an excuse will always be provided. I just want to show you that. So, Numbers 12 and verse 2. And they said, hath the Lord indeed spoken only to Moses? Hath he not spoken also by us? And the Lord heard it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that sounds
he
familiar.
And the Lord heard it. So let me give you a background on what's happening here. All of a sudden, Aaron and Miriam get all aggravated. They get jealous of what God's doing with Moses, and they start talking amongst themselves. Wait a minute, God's used us too. Aaron's like, yeah, I spoke to Pharaoh and, let my people go. Remember how I said that? Yep, I said that. Remember that? And Miriam's like, remember that time I prophesied? God used me, and I had that tambourine boy, and I was shouting down the aisles. I had a whole group of followers. You can't have a whole group of followers and not be used of God. Now, I'm using some creative liberty here. But that's kind of the idea that it's given. And they said, I don't know who he thinks he is. God has spoken through us just like he spoke to him. Who does he think he is?
Yep.
Have you ever ran your mouth about something and the person in charge or the person you're running your mouth about heard it?
Yeah.
I walked up on a particular conversation that was happening where I was the feast that was happening in that conversation. They used to say having the pastor for dinner. Well, this was having the coworker for dinner. And boy, this one lady was just running her mouth. I mean, just blah, blah, blah. And furthermore, and I just don't know, and this is, she thinks she, blah, blah. And I'm standing right behind her just listening. And I said, well, what did I say then? And she's like, oh, well, you know, really. I was like, well, come, let's talk about it. I mean, let's talk about it. That's kind of where Moses and Aaron were, or Aaron and Miriam. I keep saying Moses. Aaron and Miriam, they're running their mouth. But God heard it.
God heard it.
That's the dangerous thing about having a root of bitterness and jealousy in your heart, is that God knows it's there.
That's right.
And if you intend to say it or not, you will.
Yeah.
At some point, it'll come through your mind.
Yep.
And God will hear it. Moses knew that Miriam and Aaron were gossiping about him, but he did not defend himself. This is evident by his response when God calls the three of them to a family meeting. Verse 3. Now the man Moses was very meek, above all the men which were upon the face of the earth. Now I've struggled with that verse, because Moses is writing this. You know, that would be like, and Sister Sargent was the meekest of all, as I'm writing it in my journal. Okay, so it's weird. But you've got to remember that Moses is writing this as a history to the people. He's not just writing it so he can read it later. He wants people to know the leadership. He wants them to know, I knew they were running their mouth, and I didn't say anything. Don't you think? You have a...
Well, isn't there not debate whether Joshua wrote this?
Yes, there is. There's a debate on
And
whether or
it's
not.
in parentheses, which would suggest
It could have been added
somebody
in.
else added it.
It could have been. But the point is, Moses still gets credit for it. Whether or not he did or not, we don't know. But he gets the credit for the Pentateuch. And either way, this gives the impression that Moses knew they were talking about him and didn't open his mouth.
Yeah.
So whether he wrote it or whether Joshua wrote it, it still says he knew that they were talking.
Right.
Right?
That's right.
Okay, so he was the meekest. One commentator wrote it this way. He said, Moses was the meekest of all men and acted as a deaf man who heard not, and as a dumb man who opened not his mouth. Dumb meaning he couldn't speak, not that he was stupid. He said that he knew what they were saying, and he still didn't say anything. Verse 4, And the Lord spake suddenly unto Moses, and unto Aaron, and unto Miriam, Come out ye three unto the tabernacle of the congregation. And they three came out.
Yep.
Now, up until this point, God was not speaking directly to Miriam and to Aaron. He spoke through Moses. But when God stands up,
Mm-hmm.
God heard the complaints that Miriam had voiced, and he called the three of them to meet him at the tabernacle. God used some very straightforward terms here. He let them know that not only what they said hurt him, but it also hurt Moses. They had failed in their duty. You see, that's part of the thing as leadership. They had actually failed as leaders by running their mouth about their leader.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Shouldn't do that.
Verse 5, And the Lord came down in a pillar of the cloud and stood in the door of the tabernacle and called Aaron and Miriam, and they both came forth. And he said, Hear now my words. If there be a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known unto him in a vision, and will speak unto him in a dream. I'm going to talk to him as I see fit. This is how I'm going to deal with those who are anointed or called, the prophets, whatever. But my servant Moses is not so, who is faithful in all mine house. With him will I speak mouth to mouth.
Wow.
What he's saying is, I'm going to choose how I speak to these people. I'm going to choose how I use people. But I just want you to know that no matter how special you think you are, I talked to Moses face to face. Now, I don't think Moses could have defended himself any better. Just imagine Moses is standing there and he can hear God's looking at them saying, let me tell you something, boy. Let's talk for a minute. This reminds me of when God talked to Job and said, where were you?
Yep.
Who do you think you are?
Mhm.
Have you lost your mind? That's what it sounds like to me. He said he will speak to him mouth to mouth, even apparently and not in dark speeches. And the similitude of the Lord shall he behold. Wherefore then were ye not afraid to speak against my servant Moses? You know I speak to him face to face. We have conversations. Did it not cross your mind that this would be a bad idea to run your mouth? I mean, that's Amy's translation, but it's a good one.
Yeah.
Can you imagine how silenced the three of them would have been? Have you ever seen somebody that's really smart aleck, arrogant, and cocky be put in their place and they have nothing to say?
Uh-huh.
Yes. Oh, it's wonderful. You shouldn't enjoy it. That's not a good thing. Never enjoy that. But truthfully, in our human nature, we're thinking,
Yeah.
saw that coming. Get 'em, Lord. Get 'em. I probably would not have been able to write, and Amy was the most humble person during this time. Amy was the meekest of all. No, like Amy would have been in the back doing a victory lap, or just, smite 'em, Lord, smite 'em, because I'm human. Now, I'd like to say that that's different, and if it weren't a Wednesday night, it probably would be, but I cannot even fathom the hush that came in that room or that place when God came down off the throne to straighten a couple people out. In righteous wrath, God actually withdrew from the holy place just to straighten this situation out. There's a couple of things that are kind of important here to note. Now, in biblical writings, there is importance in the order of which something is presented. Okay? The name that comes first in a particular narrative is normally the main character or the lead. Okay? Now, I know that doesn't... Let me give you an example. When I was a kid and I was snooping under the Christmas tree to see what gifts were under there, I could tell instantly who wrapped the present. Because if my mom wrapped the present, it would say, love, Mom, and Dad. And if my dad wrapped the present, it would say, love, Dad, and Mom.
Still that way.
It's still that way, absolutely. Because that's just, and when I sign a card, I'll say, love, well, no, most of the time I actually put my husband's name first because it's just, they get smaller as they go, and I'm a little OCD on that, and that's how they go. Anyway, but in the Bible, it's kind of the same concept. For instance, in Acts, you see that Barnabas went and got Paul to take him along on a missionary journey. And so you had Barnabas and Paul. All of a sudden, it changes, and it's Paul and Barnabas. Why is that? Because Paul stepped up and took the lead. Another instance is when you've got Priscilla and Aquila. That's a husband and wife. The wife, Priscilla, is almost always first in that list of names. Most theologians actually accredit her to writing the book of Hebrews. So Priscilla was the dominant one. She was the one that was most boisterous about their convictions and the ministry and all that kind of stuff. And Aquila was good with that. Doesn't mean that he was silent. It meant they worked as a team, but she was the one that stepped up forward. Okay, so normally you have whoever the main character or the focus was, their name would have been listed first. It's because of that we can assume that Miriam was actually the ringleader of this rebellion. Because if you look back at verse 1, it says, "And Miriam and Aaron spake against Moses." Does that make sense? Generally, you would think that the guy's name would be first for the whole patriarch thing and, hierarchy and all that kind of stuff, but not if there was a ringleader. She was most likely the instigator in this particular rebellion, and that's why the punishment actually fell on her.
Wasn't she actually the one speaking when she said, "Does God yet speak to Moses only?"
I thought that, but it says, "And they said, hath God not spoken to us?" So, but the indication is that the conversation happened where she was leading it, and that's kind of reiterated later when Aaron responds to the punishment. So, because the main reason that we think that she is the instigator is because her name is first, and that she is mad. Another reason is because the issue that they're fussing about is concerning one of Moses' wives. And this lady was nothing. I mean, there's no record whatsoever of her anywhere else. There's no issue. She doesn't have children. She's not heirs to a throne, whatever. She's just there. She's not really a threat, other than the fact that she is a princess of Ethiopia. But other than that, she's not really a threat. Unless Miriam convinced herself somehow that Moses would somehow try to connect ties to Ethiopia. And the anger of the Lord was kindled against them, and he departed. And the cloud departed from off the tabernacle, and behold, Miriam became leprous, white as snow. And Aaron looked upon Miriam, and behold, she was leprous. And Aaron said unto Moses, Alas, my Lord, I beseech ye, lay not this sin upon us, wherein we have done foolishly, and we have sinned. But let her not be as one dead, of whom the flesh is half consumed, when he cometh out of his mother's womb. Aaron's heart ached. Now remember, he's a high priest at this time. He cannot touch her. He can't be near her. This is his family.
Yep.
They have been together for nearly 100 years.
That's a lot of time.
That's a lot of time. That's a lot of Thanksgiving dinners right there. That's a lot. Okay? And now he has not only separated her from her because she's unclean, but because she has sinned, and by law that he has to enforce, she is an outcast. She would have to leave outside of the camp. Do you remember where the people died with the birds? On the outskirts?
Yeah.
That's where the leprous had to go.
Yeah.
Separated from the presence of God, because they were not whole and they were unclean.
Mm-hmm.
So not only was he seeing that she was diseased, her skin was dead. Not only did he see the pain and the agony and the sorrow, he saw that he would have to separate her from the presence of God.
Yep.
That was his punishment. Hers was physical. His was, I'm responsible and I have to escort her out of the presence of God. That itself would preach.
Oh, yeah.
The people were no doubt, they were probably stepping back from her. They knew it was contagious. They knew the laws from leprosy. They knew that if leprosy was even in your house, if it would seep from the walls, like mold or fungus or whatever, that they were to burn the whole house down, clean it out. Because of the bitterness of her heart, she had fallen. She was no longer this victorious woman of God that was leading victory dances. Now she's a disgrace. At this point, she probably could not speak. Leprosy is, according to this account, she would have gone into the late stages of leprosy. Because generally with leprosy, it starts as just a couple of sores. So with her being all covered in white skin like ashes, she went to advanced stages instantly. Numbness. That's what that is. So Aaron had to plead on behalf of his sister. And he took responsibility. At this point in time, he's actually stepping away from his role as priest, and he's pleading as a head of a house. The brother often took the role of the head of the house. Remember, we saw that in Lot and with Laban. And remember, we talked about the brother taking the role. Aaron stepped up as the head of the house, the priest of the home at this time, and he spoke on behalf of his sister. This is also like Judah stepping up and intervening on behalf of Joseph. At this point, God's response to the situation completely and totally depended on Moses' response to his siblings. God did not intervene in this situation until Moses prayed for them. I want you to think about that for a second. Moses had been talked about, gossiped about. He had seen the wrath of God avenge him. And right now, the punishment of his brother and his sister, whether or not he is reconciled, whether or not he is justified, everything stands right there in his hands.
Yeah.
Have you ever thought about somebody who really did you wrong? I mean, they messed you over. Like, it was horrible. Horrible. And people don't know the truth.
Yeah.
They don't know what really happened. Imagine if you're standing there and God brings them out and he gives them a firm talking to and he punishes them and they're standing there and they're struggling and everything that you've been put through, all of a sudden it's all better. And they cry out, God, have mercy on me. And God looks at you and says, should I? You see, true forgiveness is being okay with them never having to pay for the thing they did to you.
Yeah. Yeah.
It would be easy for Moses to stand there and say, well, you had it coming. You knew better. Sorry. You should have. You did it to yourself. And he could have done that. And I think God would have honored it. God did not intervene until Moses prayed for those who had betrayed him.
Yeah.
This forced Moses to face his own ability to forgive before asking God to forgive. Because Moses had to let it go first. And then he could ask God to be merciful to them. And Moses had to be able to forgive without conditions and without specifications. But Moses cried unto the Lord in verse 13, saying, heal her now, O God, I beseech thee.
Yeah.
Heal her now. Do you hear the desperation in his voice? Heal her now. True forgiveness is being able to intervene, intercede, and pray for those who hurt you
Yes.
in a way that you want them to be restored.
Yes.
You want them to be healed. It doesn't matter what they did to you. It doesn't matter what they deserve. You want them to come to God.
Yes.
You want them to be
Yeah.
saved. Your desperation should match Moses.
Yeah.
God saved them.
Yes. Lord.
Yes, they mistreated me. Yes, they deserve everything they get, but Lord, don't let them have it. Save them.
Yeah.
Save them. And the Lord said unto Moses, if her father had spit in her face, would she not be ashamed 7 days? He's going back to the law that it's a law of disgrace. If you have whatever, if you had disappointed your family or your father, then you would be basically grounded. It's a good word for it, for 7 days. Let her be shut out from the camp 7 days, and after that, let her be received in again. And Miriam was shut out from the camp 7 days, and the people journeyed not till Miriam was brought in again. 7 days. That's a long time to think. She was on the outskirts, away from her people, away from the presence of God for 7 days. And then she came back into the camp. And the people loved her. They loved her. Even though they knew she had messed up, they loved her. And they waited until she came back in. And afterward, the people removed from Hazeroth and pitched in the wilderness of Paran. The Lord answered Moses' prayer, but there were still consequences, and there always are. There always are. Remember, Miriam, she did remain unclean for 7 days, but even more dreadful than the leprosy was that she lost her influence and she lost her ministry.
Yeah.
She had once been called a prophetess, a spiritual leader, but now her spirit of brokenness, her strength was broken, and the prophecy left her. Her bitterness had actually separated her from God's anointing. She's not spoken of again until her death. Numbers 20:1, the Bible tells us that because of her sin, Miriam died before the entrance to the Canaan land. And she's buried at Kadesh Barnea, where Israel mourned for her. She passed away on the 11th hour of the completion of Israel's journey of 40 years. On the 11th hour, on the completion of the journey of 40 years.
Mm.
1 hour to deliverance.
Wow.
That's how short. That's how tragic.
Yeah.
It is. It's tragic. God saved her, yes. He restored her, yes. But she had separated herself.
Yeah.
You know, there are actually, it's so easy to read these stories and think she should have gotten over it. She should have saw the warning signs. She should have never let that bitterness get in her. My goodness, what in the world was she thinking? Being jealous of Moses. But you know what? Life is full of things that will make a person hard and make a person bitter. But it's a choice. It's a choice. This is actually not the only story of an elderly lady. I'm going to leave you on a high note tonight. There's another lady that had a lot of reasons to be bitter and jealous. We love to see the stories of the girl who falls in love with the man of her dreams, and they're married forever, and they have kids and grandkids, and they die together hand in hand when they're 150 years old. It's a beautiful love story. It's not very realistic, but you know, that's the thing we hope for. Those are relationship goals, right? But let's look at a lady in the New Testament who had lived a long life alone in the shadows. This particular story actually picks up right after Mary and Joseph have brought baby Jesus into the temple. He's 30 days old, and after the days have been accomplished that of Mary's purification, basically, they were required to go into the temple and give an offering for the firstborn, because the Bible says that every firstborn that openeth the womb shall be called holy. And so they were to take them back into the temple, and they were to give an offering and whatever. Remember, we talked about all that, and we'll go into that probably a little bit more later. And Mary was to also give an offering or a sacrifice in order to regain her purification, to be able to worship.
Right.
Okay, so that's where this story picks up. Luke chapter 2, verses 36 and 38. And there was one Anna, a prophetess, the daughter of Phanuel, of the tribe of Aser. She was of a great age, and had lived with her husband 7 years from her virginity. And now she was a widow of about 84 years, which departed not from the temple, but served God with fastings and with prayers night and day. And she, coming in that instant, gave thanks likewise unto the Lord, and spake of him to all them that looked for the redemption in Jerusalem. That was Luke 2, 36 through 38. According to the math, now remember how old Miriam was when she decided she was bitter? She was at least 90 to 100 years old. I was probably closer to 100. According to the math, Anna had been married when she was very, very young, but then she was widowed after only 7 years. According to this timeline, she was probably maybe 12 or 13 when she got married, probably 13, maybe 14. And then she was widowed after 7 years of marriage. I mean, she was a widow for 87 years. 87 years. That's not a Hallmark movie right there. You get married when you're young, you think, oh, I'm going to be with him forever. It's going to be beautiful. It's going to be wonderful. I'm going to have this family, and it's going to be wonderful. But she was married, and then she wasn't. And she was widowed at a young age. And for 87 years, she was a widow. There is a lot that can happen to a person who becomes a widow at 87 years, or for 87 years. Doesn't say anything about her having children. At this time, if you didn't have a son to take care of you, you became actually a ward of the church. You became the property, or that they were responsible for taking care of you if you didn't remarry. And so here she is, completely and totally reliant on God's people, and hopefully it's going to work out okay. She can't really take care of herself, but the only thing she can do is commit her everything to the house of God.
Yeah.
There's not a place inside the temple for a widow woman. Levites weren't women. I mean, they had Levite women, but you couldn't work in the office of a priest as a woman.
Yeah.
That means she placed herself in a place where she didn't belong, to be close to the presence of God, because that's where her heart was.
Yeah.
For 87 years, she was faithful to a dream.
Yeah.
She was faithful to the hope that the Redeemer was going to come and restore Jerusalem. But she didn't have any proof that was going to happen. That's true faith. She could have been bitter. But because of her faithfulness, the Lord let her see their redemption as a baby boy. And she knew it. The presence of God was so powerful. She had devoted herself so much to the presence of God. When that baby came into the temple with his mom and dad, she knew who he was. Her spirit knew who he was. God honored her with a vision of the future because of her heart and because it would not entertain bitterness. The last few weeks have been very trying in my home. It has been a whole, I don't even know, just bundle of reliving memories and forgiving and letting go and moving on and pressing forward and forgetting those things that are past and pressing toward the future and all that kind of stuff. And it's been wild. And I started thinking in the process of these notes, how many visions have been squelched by bitterness? How many times have we been stuck on, I press toward the mark of the prize of the high calling, but we forget forgetting those things that are past part of that. You can't press toward the mark of the prize of the high calling while you're dragging the past with you.
That's true.
That's right. That's right.
Because Anna did not let the bitterness from the past and the hurts and the pains hold her down. God gave her a vision for the future. That's a beautiful thing right there.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any thoughts, comments, sermon bumpers, additions?
Brother Kraft made a statement to me a good while back. He said that people in this generation have lost the concept or the understanding of ministerial authority in their life. People have gotten to the place where they compare a pastor, a preacher, an evangelist, anyone anointed carrying the word of God, as just someone else with an opinion. I think when, in fact, there was a book years ago called The Tale of Three Kings, and it talked about Saul, and it talked about his pursuit of David. And even in the pursuit where Saul was trying to kill him, he respected the position of the man of God
Right.
enough that he would do no harm or even defend himself.
Right.
Ministry is not perfect.
No.
We have human emotions like everyone else, but I think in the proper perspective, any of us, when we relate to a man of God, whoever he may be, I don't think we are allowed to be in a position to be judgmental or to rate them or to qualify them. I think there's a very, very tight line of respect that every one of us needs to pay very close attention to in everything we say.
Sister Josran has a sermon series, or at least one sermon called Submitted to Reign. And it covers spiritual authority in a way that I've never heard before. And it changed the way that I see those that God has placed over me. And it's convicted me in so many ways, because it's easy to forget that God's anointed comes in flesh and blood.
Right.
Yep.
And none of us are going to be perfect until we walk on the streets of gold.
Mm-hmm.
But that does not negate the fact that God put them there. And when we as followers stand under the protection that God's placed over us, it will actually strengthen the relationship with the authority. It will strengthen our relationship with God, and it will also encourage and strengthen the authority.
Right.
And the problem, like I said, with the murmurings with the quail, is that they stepped outside of their protection to go after their cravings. Miriam stepped outside of her protection to go after her ego.
Right.
Yeah.
Happens all the time.
It does. And it's a very serious place to be. The world doesn't quite understand the concept of submission. And I think that's where a lot of misunderstandings come. They think of submission as being blind obedience.
Right.
It's not blind obedience. It's serving God like He has designed, and it's acknowledging that God is God of order.
Mm-hmm.
And there's protection and there's power in the submission.
Right.
It's not a thing of authority and somebody demeaning other people, but is protection and power in that authority and under that authority. It's good. Any other questions, thoughts? Kind of took you down a lot of rabbit holes in history today. I hope I gave you enough resources. You guys are welcome to check any of them. You will probably hear a story somewhere along the lines. You'll hear a sermon about how Moses and Aaron rebelled because Zipporah was Ethiopian. And when they do, just you worship with them, and when you hear that sermon, just praise God anyway and run the aisles, because 99% of that sermon was meant for you. You just ignore the fact Zipporah was not Ethiopian. That's beside the point. Just keep worshiping.